By the autumn of 1943, German commanders occupying France were staring at numbers that didn't add up. Field Marshal Rundstedt's own records showed acts of rail sabotage had jumped from a monthly average of roughly 130 incidents earlier that year to 534 in September alone, a fourfold increase attributed at the time to weapons and explosives parachuted in by the British. Some of it was easy enough to explain: cut tracks, demolition charges, the visible deliberate signature of resistance fighters at work. But not all of it. Locomotives that had run reliably for years were suddenly failing. Boilers that should have had service life left in them were bursting without warning. To the engineers and railway inspectors filing the reports, some of these incidents looked exactly like what they had always looked like before the war: ordinary mechanical failure, the routine wear of a rail network being driven harder than it was built for. What German investigators could not have known, because the entire design of the thing forbade it, was that hidden somewhere inside that pile of routine accident reports were weapons built for the express purpose of being mistaken for routine accidents. Lumps of coal that were not coal at all. Hollow shells, painted and dusted to match the exact color of whatever fuel was burning in a given region, carrying a quarter-pound of explosive and a detonator sitting in a tender or a bunker, waiting to be shoveled by hand into a firebox by a man who had no way of telling the difference. If the device worked as intended, no one would ever know it had worked at all. That was the entire point. 80 years later, that same design feature would create a very different kind of problem, not for the German railway system, but for historians trying to write its history. In March 2022, the CIA published a short, dense article by an in-house historian named David Welker, attempting to settle once and for all how this weapon had actually performed during the war. What he found directly contradicted a story that had, by then, gone viral: the claim that British and American intelligence had used disguised coal bombs to destroy more than 1,000 German locomotives, crippling the Nazi war machine from the inside. It is a magnificent story. It is also, according to the one government historian who has actually gone looking for proof, almost entirely unsupported. What Welker found instead was stranger and in some ways more unsettling than the myth. The device was real. It had been built by the thousands, manufactured in English country houses and American research labs, smuggled to resistance fighters across occupied Europe and agents across Asia. But its confirmed combat record was almost non-existent, not because it failed, but because of the same evidentiary fog that had confused German rail inspectors in 1943. A successful attack and an ordinary accident were designed to look identical. This is the story of a weapon almost nobody can prove worked, and why, by the strange logic of sabotage, that may be the highest compliment its designers could have asked for. It runs through a Confederate spy who died broke, a film director's costume department, a double agent who handed his bomb to the enemy of his own handlers, and a woman who delivered the only attack on this list anyone can say with real confidence actually happened. 8,000 miles from Germany, against an enemy nobody talks about when they tell this story. It begins 80 years before anyone in London ever thought of it. To understand the Second World War's exploding coal, you first have to leave the Second World War entirely. In 1863, the American Civil War had ground into its third year, and the Confederacy was desperate for an edge against the Union Navy's blockade. The Confederate Congress had already taken an unusual step. It offered letters of marque, authorizing private inventors to design weapons that could sink enemy ships, with a financial incentive attached, half the value of any vessel destroyed. War, for some men, had become an entrepreneurial opportunity. One of those men was Thomas Edgeworth Courtenay, an Irish immigrant who had left Belfast for Baltimore in 1842. By the time the war reached its third year, Courtenay had an idea. Union ships were powered by coal-fed boilers, and that coal was typically stored in open piles with little to no security, a vulnerability so basic it had simply never been exploited. Courtenay proposed hollowing out lumps of coal, packing them with black powder, and disguising them so convincingly that they could be slipped into a Union coal pile and shoveled unknowingly straight into a ship's firebox. He arrived in Richmond in November 1863 to make his pitch. The reaction split along predictable lines. Secretary of War James Seddon was skeptical. President Jefferson Davis was impressed. By December, Seddon had approved testing anyway, and by January 1864, castings were complete at an artillery shop near the Tredegar Iron Works. Courtenay himself wrote, with evident pride, that the finished product was so convincing, the most critical eye could not detect it. He wasn't exaggerating. By February, testing was finished, formal approval came through, and Davis personally appropriated funds for Courtenay to build the devices and recruit 24 men to plant them. There was just one problem, and it arrived almost immediately: a man named Joseph Ludi. Ludi was a molder, one of the workers actually casting the bombs, who deserted to a Union vessel and told his rescuers everything. He had made the shells himself, he said. He could no longer tell the difference between a real lump of coal and a fake one, even though he'd built them. It was, in its own way, the perfect description of the weapon's danger, and the first sign that no sabotage operation built around dozens of recruited men was going to stay secret for long. Within weeks, Union intelligence had a name to go with the threat. Captured mail from Courtenay, intercepted by the USS Signal in March, described the bombs in detail. Rear Admiral David Porter issued a fleet-wide order, armed guards on every coal pile, and summary execution for anyone caught planting one of these devices. A month later, the Chicago Tribune ran the story and named Courtenay outright. Whatever operational secrecy the weapon had depended on was now gone, splashed across a newspaper that Union officers up and down the Atlantic seaboard could read over breakfast. And yet, astonishingly, the weapon worked anyway, at least once. On November 27, 1864, an explosion tore through the steamer Greyhound on the James River, with Union General Benjamin Butler aboard and Admiral Porter himself standing nearby. The senior officers escaped. The ship did not. To this day, it remains the only attack in the entire historical record, Civil War or otherwise, that historians consider a definitively confirmed kill by an exploding coal bomb. Everything else attributed to Courtenay's invention sits in a fog of plausible deniability that would become the weapon's defining characteristic. In April 1864, the USS Chenango's boiler burst on her maiden voyage in New York, killing 33 men. Officially, it was a faulty boiler. Courtenay claimed credit in a private letter. "My work is beginning to tell on the Yankees," but no one could prove it either way. A year later, the steamboat Sultana exploded with roughly 1,700 people aboard, many of them recently freed prisoners of war, heading home. Some newspapers blamed a coal torpedo. Most experts, then and now, blame catastrophic boiler neglect instead. This ambiguity is not a footnote to the story. It is the story. A weapon engineered to mimic an accident will always generate disputes that can never be fully settled, because the entire point was to make sabotage indistinguishable from bad luck. Courtenay never got to enjoy whatever success he'd had. When Richmond fell in April 1865, Union troops searching Jefferson Davis's abandoned writing desk found something waiting for them: an inert coal bomb sitting in plain view, never deployed. Confederate Secret Service records were burned by Secretary of State Judah Benjamin as the government collapsed, erasing whatever true tally of the weapon's use might have existed. Courtenay spent the following decade trying to sell his invention abroad, to England, Chile, Austria, Prussia, Italy, Turkey. He found no buyers anywhere. He died in September 1875, having, in the words of the CIA's own historian, never sold his invention to a single client. He had even refused the rank of captain throughout his service, insisting on being addressed as Mr., almost certainly to protect his personal financial claim to the Confederacy's ship destruction bounty, in case there was ever money to collect. There wasn't. The idea, though, refused to die with him. In 1881, Arthur Conan Doyle fictionalized the coal torpedo in a short story. During the First World War, suspiciously coal-shaped devices turned up aboard a transatlantic steamer, on a Norwegian freighter, and in a shipment headed to a Detroit area power plant. German sabotage was suspected each time, and proven none of them. And then, in 1940, with France falling and Britain alone, the idea found its second life, in the unlikeliest of places, a requisitioned English country house where a small group of engineers had just been told their job was to set Europe ablaze. The phrase belongs to Winston Churchill. In July 1940, according to the diary of Minister of Economic Warfare, Hugh Dalton, the Prime Minister, gave a simple instruction for the new sabotage organization. Dalton was standing up. Go and set Europe ablaze. That organization became the Special Operations Executive, SOE, formed from 3 earlier intelligence efforts that had been competing rather than cooperating. There was Section D of the Secret Intelligence Service, which had quietly begun planning economic sabotage against Germany as early as 1938. There was military intelligence, research, a small unit focused on guerrilla tactics, and there was a propaganda arm, Electra House. SOE merged all 3 into a single body with one job: arm and direct resistance across occupied Europe with whatever cheap, deniable, mass-producible sabotage tools its engineers could invent. Coal was an obvious target. As Welker's research would later describe it, coal sat openly in huge piles or bins with no security, each lump indistinguishable from 1,000 others, and yet uniquely irregular enough that a disguised explosive could hide among real coal like a needle lost in its own haystack. It was, in short, the same vulnerability Courtenay had spotted 80 years earlier in Union coal yards, except now the target system mattered more than ever. Railways powered the entire German war economy in occupied Europe, and railways ran on coal. The work of building the new version of the weapon fell to a network of requisitioned English country houses scattered through Hertfordshire, a real-life laboratory district that would later earn the nickname Q Branch, after the fictional gadget master of the Bond novels not yet written. Station 9, at a house called the Fryth, handled general weapons and explosives research. Station 17th, Brick and Donbury, ran sabotage training and explosive trials. Station 14th, Brigands, forged identity papers. And Station 12th, Aston House near Stevenage, became the center of coal bomb development specifically, after Section D's research moved there from its previous home, Bletchley Park. That move alone tells you something about how seriously Britain took operational security. Someone, at some point, looked at the world's most important code-breaking operation sitting in the same compound as live explosives testing, and decided that was a bad idea. Aston House became its own dedicated facility, commanded by Colonel Leslie John Cardew Wood, a man some historians consider the true inspiration for the fictional Q, and staffed by engineers who were, by most accounts, brilliant, eccentric, and not especially fond of rules. Chief among them was Cecil Vanderpeer Clark, known to almost everyone as Nobby, a decorated First World War veteran who had run a trailer company in Bedford before the war, and who would go on to co-invent the limpet mine and help modify the grenade used in the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. Clark's relationship with authority was, generously, complicated. He reportedly slipped past Aston House's own security on his first day there, simply to prove he could. Years later, he forged his own inspection pass and walked, unannounced, into Luton Power Station, not to sabotage it, but to demonstrate exactly how easy sabotage against British infrastructure would be if the Germans ever tried it. Clark was also the man who filmed the surviving 16mm test footage of explosive coal in action, footage that still exists today in the Imperial War Museum's archive. The earliest version of the weapon was almost embarrassingly simple, a tool nicknamed the coal borer, which drilled a hole into an actual lump of real coal. From there, the technical evolution moved quickly. An explosive coal kit followed, factory-molded fake coal paired with a range of paints, because coal color varied noticeably from region to region across occupied Europe, and a German inspector who noticed an unusually black lump in a Belgian coal yard might ask questions. Then came a molded clamshell design from Station 15, made of dyed plaster coated in real coal dust. The final iteration eliminated even the telltale seam of the clamshell, a metal case charge with liquid plaster poured directly around it. One of the best surviving descriptions of this process comes not from an officer, but from a lab assistant named Arthur Christie, whose account survives in Des Turner's History of Aston House. Christie was simply told to drill a hole in each lump of coal without shattering it. He had no idea why. I wonder what the hell they want this for, he remembered thinking. Don't ask, just do it. Only later, once he was instructed to pack a quarter-pound of plastic explosive and a detonator into the hole and glue the coal dust back over it, did he understand. The finished lump would sit in a locomotive's coal tender, waiting to be shoveled into the firebox. That quarter-pound figure matters. The explosive most commonly used was Nobel's explosive 808, a green plasticine-like compound with a faint almond smell, which would later lend its texture and reputation to a word the world still uses today. British wartime slang shortened plastic explosive to plastique, a term that entered the wider language through SOE's own French-labeled packaging meant for resistance fighters across the channel. The same compound supplied through the same channels would later be used in the July 1944 attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Across the Atlantic, the Americans were building their own version in parallel. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, established in mid-1942, ran its research and development branch under a chemist named Stanley Lovell, a man director Wild Bill Donovan nicknamed his own Professor Moriarty. Lovell's coal bomb used a different explosive entirely, a high-powered compound called 6040 pentolite, cast into molds taken from real lumps of coal, reinforced with black enameled scrim against breakage, and coated with a plastic cement containing lamp black to complete the disguise. It came with its own paint kit, allowing field agents to match the local coal supply wherever they were operating. What's striking, in hindsight, is how openly the two Allied agencies cooperated on this particular weapon. Unlike Courtenay, 80 years earlier, who had guarded his invention jealously, hoping to sell it for profit, the OSS simply shared its design with the British. No charge, no negotiation. It is a small but telling contrast. One man's sabotage invention as a private fortune he never managed to cash in, versus a wartime alliance treating the same idea as common property in a shared fight. By the time both programs were running at full capacity, SOE alone had manufactured roughly 3.5 tons of explosive coal between 1941 and 1945. No surviving record breaks that figure down into individual devices or separates the explosive versions from a parallel incendiary design, one that tellingly turned out to be largely useless inside an actual boiler and was repurposed instead for setting stubborn coal store fires. The device took its place in SOE's official descriptive catalog of special devices and supplies, a real document, still held today at Britain's National Archives, that reads like the inventory of a particularly dark toy shop. Explosive coal sat alongside explosive wood, disguised as ordinary firewood logs. Beside it, explosive rats designed on the theory that a dead rat tossed near a furnace was something a stoker would instinctively shovel into the fire without thinking twice. Explosive soap, explosive books, an entire taxonomy of ordinary objects, weaponized. All of it shared the same underlying philosophy and the same fundamental weakness. A coal bomb sitting in a bin might never be shoveled into a firebox at all. It might sit there for months, or it might go in cold and never reach the temperature needed to detonate. The randomness that made the weapon nearly undetectable also made it almost impossible to aim. Once the enemy discovered such devices existed, which they inevitably would, every coal pile in occupied Europe became a potential threat that had to be inspected, guarded, and feared. That fear, as it turned out, may have been the real weapon all along. But proving that fear translated into actual destroyed locomotives, sunk ships, burned factories, would turn out to be the hardest part of this entire story. If explosive coal had a single defining operation, a clean mission with a beginning, middle, and end, this would be a much simpler film. It doesn't. What survives instead is a scattered handful of documented episodes, separated by oceans and years of wildly varying reliability. Reconstructing them in order is the closest thing to watching the weapon actually work. The first comes not from sabotage at all, but from counter-sabotage. A story that begins with a convicted English safecracker named Eddie Chapman. Chapman had a criminal record before the war even started. He parachuted into Britain in December 1942 as a trained covert agent, then promptly turned himself in to MI5, beginning one of the most remarkable double agent careers of the entire war under the codename Zigzag. In January 1943, British intelligence staged a fake sabotage of the de Havilland aircraft factory, convincing enough, with the right camouflage work and a planted newspaper story, to fool German aerial reconnaissance and cement Chapman standing with his German handlers. 2 months later, Chapman boarded the city of Lancaster bound for Lisbon, traveling under the cover identity Hugh Anson. There, his obver handlers gave him a new assignment and a new tool to carry it out. 2 German-manufactured coal bombs with instructions to use them to sink the very ship that had carried him. This is where the story turns genuinely tense. Chapman was a doubled man walking through enemy territory carrying a live weapon meant to kill him along with everyone else aboard. One mistake, a slipped word, a moment's hesitation, a German contact who suspected too much, and there was no walking it back. He didn't use the bombs. He handed them to the ship's captain, who locked them away for analysis. When the vessel reached Glasgow, British officials staged something almost theatrical in its own right, a furious search of the coal bunkers, loud enough and visible enough to be reported back to Chapman's German handlers, as evidence that the sabotage attempt had genuinely taken place and failed only by bad luck, not betrayal. The deception worked. The Germans never suspected Chapman had handed his weapon straight to British intelligence. They would go on to award him the Iron Cross, the first Englishman to receive one since 1871, for an attack that never happened, carried out by a man actively betraying them the entire time. For British intelligence, the real prize wasn't the foiled attack, it was the bombs themselves. A genuine sample of German-manufactured coal-disguised explosive, delivered into MI5's hands without firing a shot or losing an asset. A few months later, on the other side of the Atlantic, the same weapon appeared in a very different context, not as an instrument of deception, but as a straightforward act of sabotage that collapsed almost immediately under its own weight. In June 1942, 8 Abwehr-trained saboteurs landed from U-boats on beaches in New York and Florida, carrying crates of explosives, some disguised per the operation's own later records as ordinary lumps of coal, along with detonators and incendiary devices built into everyday pen and pencil sets. Their targets were ambitious: aluminum plants, hydroelectric facilities, American railroads. Their plan was to use the coal bombs the same way Courtney had imagined it 80 years earlier, thrown into railroad coal cars, waiting to be shoveled into an engine. It never got that far. One of the 8, George Dash, lost his nerve almost as soon as he landed. He phoned the FBI directly, was initially dismissed as a crank, then walked into a bureau office in person and confessed everything, betraying his entire team, including his own second-in-command, Ernest Berger. The arrest came within roughly 2 weeks of the landing. 6 of the 8 saboteurs were executed. Dash and Berger, in exchange for their cooperation, were imprisoned instead, their sentences later commuted by President Roosevelt. Edgar Hoover, for his part, claimed sole credit for cracking the plot in public statements, quietly burying the inconvenient truth that the entire operation had been undone not by brilliant FBI detective work, but by one frightened saboteur dialing a phone number. Not a single coal bomb in Operation Pastorius ever reached a firebox. The weapon's American debut ended before it began. There is one more documented episode worth placing on the record, though it survives on far thinner evidence than either of these. A brief mention, hedged with the word probably, that Yugoslav home guards used a coal bomb to sabotage a railroad coal car and damage coal barges on the Danube River. The underlying source is a single 1963 academic study, with no date, no location, and no unit identified. It is the kind of claim a careful historian includes precisely because it cannot be confirmed or dismissed outright. A reminder of how much of this story exists in exactly that uncomfortable gray zone. Which brings the story finally to the one operation that almost everyone researching this weapon agrees is the best documented confirmed kill of the entire war, and it happens nowhere near Germany. Her name was Elizabeth McIntosh. Everyone who knew her called her Betty. By early 1945, McIntosh was a journalist turned OSS officer, fluent in Japanese, working for the agency's Morale Operations Branch, the unit responsible for black propaganda, forged documents, and rumors designed to demoralize Japanese troops. She had recently arrived in Kunming, China, as part of a project supplying Chinese and Korean agents with instructions on how to place OSS coal-shaped devices into railroad coal bunkers. This is the turning point of the entire film, and it is also the moment the popular myth quietly falls apart. Everything the legend tells you points toward Europe: German locomotives, the Reich's railways, Hitler's war machine, grinding to a halt one sabotage lump at a time. But when historians actually go looking for a confirmed kill, the trail doesn't lead to France or Germany at all. It leads to a woman in southern China, handing a single disguised explosive to a Chinese OSS agent. The device had a nickname, Black Joe. McIntosh delivered it personally. The agent who received it boarded a train carrying Japanese soldiers, placed the bomb where it needed to go, and got off before it detonated. As the train crossed a bridge, the device exploded. The engine in the bridge crossing beneath it became the best attested operational success this entire weapon ever achieved. McIntosh herself would later downplay her own role, telling the Washington Post decades afterward with a kind of plain, unsentimental honesty, "I was just the one who handed it to the guy who did the job." It is worth sitting with how much weight that sentence carries. A woman whose day job was fabricating lies for psychological warfare, speaking with total candor about a moment that actually killed people. There's a popular online claim that the bomb's nickname, Black Joe, traces back to Stanley Lovell, the OSS's chief inventor. It doesn't. No verified quote exists tying Lovell to that name. The nickname belongs to McIntosh. One more small correction in a story riddled with internet-era misattributions, including the persistent myth that the British explosive was called Nobel 88. It wasn't. It was Nobel 808. This is the real twist at the heart of the documentary. Not a bigger explosion, not a higher body count. A complete inversion of where the story is supposed to take place. The myth insists this was a weapon that broke Germany. The evidence says its one clearly confirmed combat success was against Japan, delivered by a propagandist rather than a saboteur on a railway bridge that most people telling this story have never even heard of. And the silence surrounding the European theater is not an absence of effort. It's the weapon working exactly as designed. David Welker's research is blunt on this point. A successful coal bomb left almost no evidence that an explosion was sabotage at all. German records from the period are full of unexplained boiler failures and locomotive losses. But a boiler bursting was an ordinary mechanical event in the steam age, the kind of accident that happened constantly with or without saboteurs involved. German investigators finding wreckage consistent with a normal failure would log it as exactly that. There was no reason for them to suspect otherwise, and every reason for the saboteurs to want it that way. Welker doesn't speculate beyond what the evidence allows. He writes only that the coal bombs might also have been behind various unexplained German railroad and ship explosions, a careful historian's way of saying, we genuinely cannot know in either direction. This is the uncomfortable core of the entire weapon. Its success is, by design, indistinguishable from its absence. A bomb that worked looks identical to an accident that simply happened. That is not a flaw in the historical record. That is the device functioning precisely as its inventors intended, which means the very evidence that would prove the myth's 1,000 locomotives claim could never exist in the first place, even if every word of the legend were somehow true. So where, then, did the real large-scale destruction of German locomotives actually come from? Because there is genuine, well-documented mass destruction of German rail capacity in this period. It simply has nothing to do with coal. In 1944, ahead of the Normandy invasion, French resistance networks activated a coordinated sabotage plan known as Plan Vert, targeting rail infrastructure across northern France in direct support of D-Day. Combined with Allied bombing, this campaign destroyed on the order of 1,500 locomotives in 1944 alone. German records from the Western Occupation Command show 500 locomotives lost to sabotage or air attack in March 1944 alone. In just the first 3 months of that year, resistance saboteurs disabled more than 800 locomotives through direct demolition charges, physically cutting tracks and destroying engines, compared to fewer than 400 lost to Allied air attack in the same period. That is the real source of the staggering locomotive numbers that circulate online. It is an extraordinary, well-documented achievement of European resistance sabotage, overwhelmingly through track demolition and bombing, not through disguised explosives hidden in coal bins. The myth didn't invent its numbers from nothing. It borrowed a real, verified statistic from an entirely different operation and pasted it onto a weapon that never produced anything close to that scale of confirmed destruction. It is, in its own way, the most human kind of historical distortion, not a fabrication built from nothing, but a true number, ripped from its real context and reattached to a more cinematic story. By the war's end, explosive coal had quietly become one item among many in a much larger sabotage catalog, rather than the war-altering superweapon later internet retellings would make of it. SOE itself was dissolved in January 1946, its research staff largely absorbed into Britain's Secret Intelligence Service. The OSS, dismantled even earlier, became the institutional seed of what would emerge in 1947 as the Central Intelligence Agency, the same agency whose historian 75 years later would be the one to finally separate this weapon's documented reality from its online mythology. The people scatter from here in different directions, and the contrast between them says almost everything about how unevenly history remembers its participants. Cecil Nobby Clark, the audacious engineer who filmed the surviving test footage, went on to help design the grenade used in the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most consequential targeted killings of the entire war. His coal bomb footage survives today in the Imperial War Museum's archive, a rare visual record of a weapon that otherwise left almost nothing behind. Eddie Chapman lived out a long and improbable post-war life, his story eventually told in multiple books and adaptations. His Iron Cross, earned through an elaborate deception of the people who awarded it, remaining one of the strangest decorations in the history of espionage. Elizabeth McIntosh went on to join the newly formed CIA and later wrote 2 memoirs about her OSS years. During her time in wartime China, she had also befriended a fellow OSS officer named Julia Child, yes, the future chef, 2 women working inside the same secretive branch, in a theater of the war that rarely gets its due in popular memory. McIntosh died in 2015, at 100 years old, having spent the final decades of her life giving interviews about a war she'd helped wage with forged rumors and a lump of coal nicknamed Black Joe. George Dash, the saboteur who turned in his own team, spent the rest of his life trying, and largely failing, to get the American government to acknowledge what he had actually done. He had expected gratitude. He received a prison sentence and a public narrative, pushed by J. Edgar Hoover, that erased his role almost entirely in favor of a story about brilliant federal detective work. And Thomas Courtney, the Confederate inventor whose idea started all of this 80 years earlier, never lived to see any of it. He died in 1875, having sold his invention to no one, his name barely a footnote outside specialist Civil War scholarship, until a CIA historian resurrected it in 2022 to explain where the supposedly British weapon had actually come from. What's left when you add it all up is a strange kind of ledger, a handful of confirmed or near-confirmed operational uses, one clear, one probable, one prevented, one that never even attempted, 3.5 tons of manufactured material whose precise deployment count nobody can state with confidence, and one enormous internet-born statistic, 1,000 destroyed locomotives, that traces back to nothing, while the genuinely real 1,500 locomotive figure belongs to an entirely different sabotage campaign that has nothing to do with coal at all. If you were building a case for or against this weapon's importance, The honest verdict sits somewhere uncomfortable in between. It was not the war-winning device the myth describes, but it was also not nothing. Welker's own research is explicit that its real strategic value lay in what it forced the enemy to do: guard every coal pile, inspect every fuel delivery, divert manpower and attention toward a threat that might be sitting unexploded in any bin in any rail yard across occupied territory. That diversion of resources, even without a single confirmed German kill, was itself a form of victory. Fear has a logistics cost. Even when it never detonates, there is a temptation in telling a story like this to land on something tidy, a moral about how war forces ordinary objects to become weapons, or how history gets distorted in the retelling. Both of those things are true here. Neither is the most interesting fact this research actually turned up. The most interesting fact is this: the only attack in the entire 160-year history of this weapon, from a Confederate captain's workshop in 1864 to a Chinese railway bridge in 1945, that historians on both ends of that timeline are willing to call definitively confirmed, are separated by 81 years, 2 different wars, 2 different continents, and 2 completely unrelated inventors who never knew of each other's work. One destroyed a Union general's steamer on the James River. The other destroyed a Japanese troop train near Kunming. Everything built and deployed in between, 3.5 tons of disguised explosive, an entire branch of British and American wartime engineering, a network of country house laboratories nicknamed after a fictional spy, gadgeteer who didn't yet exist, produced, as far as the documentary record allows anyone to say with confidence, almost nothing else that can be proven. That is not a story about a weapon that failed. It is a story about a weapon that was never meant to leave proof of its own success, and which therefore, by its own design, made certain that no one, not even the CIA's own historian 80 years later, would ever be able to give it the credit or deny it the credit that the internet has tried to assign it either way.